Well, good morning, everyone. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. When we left off last week, Solomon was depressed. He says, "Therefore I hated life," in verse 17, because he had tested all of those things that we looked at last week, starting with wisdom, riches, and experience, and he had found all wanting as far as, or grasping for the wind, or vanity, ultimately. And so he's quite depressed, and then he turns around in verse 24, and starting there, he seems to shift gears. And there is quite the difference in what he has to say. Well, we're going to read from verse 24 through to verse 15, and then we'll analyze the text. So, "Nothing is better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken away from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That which has already been and that which is yet to be, that which is to have, and that is to be has already been, and God requires an account of what is past." So, might I start by saying that I think that one of the reasons why this thought appears so jarring is the way that our Bible is laid out, is that the thought appears to be directly linked with what just came before. Then we have this chapter division in chapter 3. I believe that Solomon actually starts his new thought at verse 24, that if we insist on chapter divisions with headers, which are a man-made invention and not the way that Solomon would have written it, that chapter 3, even though the part that where it is right now does seem to be a natural fit, that with the thought that he has, that it would be better if chapter 3 actually started where verse 24 is in chapter 2 right now. That all of a sudden shift would not seem so radical in the mind. And yet it still is rather jarring. It appears to, on the surface, contradict what he just finished saying, which is that it doesn't matter really. We all die. The fool suffers the same fate as the wise. And even a person who's labored for things could end up leaving it to somebody who squanders it, which history will tell us does appear to be the case. I want you to notice that Solomon has introduced a dimension now. So how do we explain this difference? How do we explain this sudden seeming change? Well, first of all, let's note that Solomon has introduced a spiritual dimension. Previous to this, he only mentioned God once, really, and that was in verse 13 of chapter 1. For the most part, he has been looking at things from an entirely physical, non-spiritual perspective. Now, starting at the end of chapter 2 in verse 24, he mentions God in verse 24, he mentions him in verse 26, he mentions him in verse 10, 11, 13, 14, and 15. Directly, he mentions him, I think, 5 or 6 times in this portion of text. So there is a noticeable shift in perspective. He bookends that nothing is better than man should enjoy his labor, both here in verse 24, and he ends the thought as well in verse 13. But I think that the key to understanding really what Solomon is saying is to look at verse 1 through 8 and analyze that first. So, there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. We read that section. This is one of the best recognized scriptures. Even those among people that don't know in the world, that don't know their Bible very well, there's certain portions that people recognize. And this is one of those portions that people recognize. If they don't necessarily recognize the verse here, sometimes they'll end up quoting, I think, a slightly corrupted version of it, which is, well, there's a reason for everything that happens in life. There's a purpose for everything, or God has a plan. Sometimes I think that people can take that, generally speaking, I think that sometimes that can be true. There is a purpose for life. God planning every single thing that happens, I think, is an over-application of that. But generally, people agree with this thought and understand that there's different times in life where different things happen. Also, I think one of the reasons why it's recognized is it was popularized, and I mentioned, if you want to put, so the Byrds in 1965 put this in song, and you may occasionally hear it on the radio. It is almost a word-for-word quote of the song. It is, for the most part, a faithful rendition, though it's ordered a little bit slightly, and they put a thought in there at the end that isn't Solomon's. But other than that, it is almost a verbatim quote of the song. And so it's been popularized, and they're not the only ones. It's just that happens to be probably the most popular version. Let's look at what specifically Solomon is saying. There is a time for every purpose under heaven. So he does divide life. There is an appropriate time for all of these, and each of these does have a purpose. Well, there's some things over which we have little control. A time to be born, we have absolutely no say or choice in that. It happened, we just have to accept it. A time to die, we generally have little control over that. There's things that I think we can do that can make that date happen sooner than it necessarily would naturally, or things can happen to us that are unexpected. But for most part, we don't really have a control over when we die. A time to mourn can sometimes be outside of our control. You got a phone call in the middle of the night and a loved one has died unexpectedly. That is not within our control. That is something that has happened. A time to mourn, if we're mourning over sin, that is in our control, and that is the right response to do. So that sometimes can be under our control, and sometimes it isn't. Major life events. Some of them can be divided into business. For example, a time to reap and a time to sow. The majority of people in Solomon's time were farmers. And up until about a century ago, that was for the most part, the most common profession. And if you confuse the two times, you're not going to be doing so well. In fact, you'll probably be begging your neighbor in order to help you survive. You have to know the wisdom of when to reap and when to sow. The same time in business, a time to gather stones, a time to cast away stones. If we look at business opportunities, it's unwise. We always talk about, let's people should save. People should save more money, and I definitely agree. We live in a society that we pull out the credit cards too often for everything. But imagine if all you did your whole life was save, and never spent. You'd actually probably have a lower net worth by the end of it than people who had saved, recognized a good opportunity to buy an asset, bought that asset which increased in value, or put their money to work for them. And that's what the wisest people do. They don't end up, at some point they go from working for their money to having their money work for them, either in investments or business opportunities. One has to recognize that there is a time to save or to hold on to money, and there is a time in which, here's a good opportunity to invest in something. Here's a good opportunity to buy. Wisdom can help us determine which that is. There's a time to embrace, and there is a time to refrain from embracing. Again, these are life events. This is a romantic event that Solomon is talking about. So we recognize that the time to embrace is within the context of marriage, that sexual relationships outside of marriage between a man and a woman who are married according to what Jesus describes in Matthew 19, anything outside of that, that's not the time to be embracing. But even in the marriage relationship, Paul does talk about there being occasions when it is appropriate for there to be an interlude for a certain period of time. Relationships. So Solomon he's covering all bases in this part. Love, hate, tear, sow, war, peace. These are all relationships. It's interesting that he puts the term in there, love, hate. We think, well, hate has no part. And generally, I would agree, especially in the Christian's life, our default to be doing things is from a motive of love. So not hatred in the sense, unless it is, of course, that we are hating sin and the things that it brings, not necessarily the sinner. A time of war and a time of peace, there is conflict that arises. He can be talking here just in general of the world, that there is a time of war and there is a time of peace. And in fact, he's not talking academically Solomon in his day. There was literally a time of war. We even read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 11, when it said it was the time of year where the kings went out to war. And David didn't go with them that particular time. So there was a time when kings typically, if they were going to fight, they would fight. There was a season for that. And a time of peace. And peace is obviously preferable because of the horrors that war bring. Conflict is a natural thing in human life, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a result of sin. There can be differences of opinion, strong differences of opinion and conflict, even among those that are in the body of Christ. Paul and Barnabas getting into a disagreement over John Mark. I don't think either of us would say that they had sinned in that argument. They had a strong disagreement. They agreed to go their separate ways. I think it's evidence that it didn't affect their relationship in the long term, and eventually Paul did accept John Mark. But that was a conflict. That was a conflict between two righteous individuals who saw things from a different perspective, and it is what it is. So the quality, and the last one that Solomon talks about in this context is largely the quality of life as determined by wisdom. So what do I mean by that? Well, I always talked about recognizing business opportunities. A lot of these is learning. A lot of the things in our life can go better for us if we recognize when is the appropriate time, and to accept that it is the appropriate time to be doing one of these activities or the other. And I think in our day-to-day life, we can really relate with a time to keep silence and a time to speak. There are times in life when it's better just to keep our mouth shut. We might know of something that's really nobody's business, and so we don't talk. It could be that somebody is trying to spread a rumor, and in order for a rumor to spread, it requires more than one individual, and we choose to not have anything to do with that situation. It could be that somebody has done something that really annoys us, and we are about to open our mouth and give them a tongue lashing and really dress them down, and then we think, you know what, maybe patience is the better thing to do in this circumstance. I'm going to let this go. Is this really worth making a big deal of? Because once that word is out there, it's very difficult to take it back. On the other hand, there's a time to speak. Somebody's having a difficult time. Well, maybe it would be best if we took the time to talk about them, let them know that we care, to listen. Certainly, if there's an opportunity to preach the gospel and we just go, well, yeah, that's kind of difficult, brother. Well, hope that works out for you, and just keep on walking. That may have been a time when we basically did keep silent when we should have spoke. So a lot of our life's problems can be caused by confusing the two. Speaking when we should have kept silent and keeping silent when we should have spoken. Probably, if you have managed to figure out in life when the best time to do both is, and apply it consistently, you're probably the wisest person that I've ever met. This requires an extraordinary amount of wisdom, self-control, understanding, and being in tune with both ourselves and with other people. And there's a reason why I think that James basically says, James and Solomon even in this book will say essentially that there's no one that talks that doesn't at some point sin with their mouth. That's how difficult it is to get that right. But there it is in the list, and a lot of what we do in life can be made better or worse. Our weeping and our laughing can largely be determined by how wise we've been. If we were that person that mixed up the time to reap and sow, we're going to be weeping. We're going to be weeping because of our own folly and lack of perception. And we could be the person that does invest wisely and does do well in life, and we're going to be laughing, as it were. We are going to have a good life. But what's Solomon's point? We could get into the weeds here a little too much in each one of the things that he's saying. What he's saying is right there in verse 1. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. There is a time when each one of these is appropriate, and who has ordained this general structure to life? Verse 10, I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken away from it. God does it, that men should fear before him. God has set up a time and place for the general purpose and activities of life. There is, because of all of these different activities, some of which can often be almost seemingly the opposite or against each other, a certain amount which Solomon was becoming depressed because he was trying to find the single silver bullet answer to everything in life. If riches is all there is to life, then Solomon cannot accept that there is a time to lose. He will be incapable of accepting that there are times in life when we won't have as much, and we have to learn to depend. If his life is simply about always seeking joy and always seeking entertainment, he is never going to be never going to be able to accept that there's a time to break down, that there is a time to mourn, that there is a time to weep, that there is a time to refrain from embracing, because that avenue of life that he chose to pursue would be constantly about stimulation. And when something comes along in life that's against that, he's going to get depressed about it. Yes, even the difficult things in life, there is a time and a place for. We turn forward in the book to chapter 7. He puts it way more plainly right here. He says, "Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful." That's pretty easy, isn't it? "But in the day of adversity, consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him." The day of prosperity, it's easy for us to be joyful. But there's an opportunity in the day of adversity. And he has said, and I'm not saying, Solomon is not saying that God has planned out our lives in such a way that you're going to have, Jeremy, Tuesday, August 24th of 2027 is going to be a real bad day for you, and I've already picked it out. Life being life, and Solomon talks about that. Eventually, bad things are going to happen and intersect. God does not have to plan out individual bad things to happen to us. But there are times when we will encounter adversity in life. And we need to accept that, as well as the times of joy. They are learning opportunities. They're, as we sometimes jokingly say, character building exercises. There are things to learn in adversity as well as there are. And I think if you look at the people who in life who have actually gone through difficult times, you'll find that they are better individuals to spend time with than people who have lived a life of ease and luxury and, generally speaking, have not really experienced life or any hardship. My experience has been that the people that fall in the latter category are generally spoiled. When something bad happens, they blow it out of proportion. It's the end of the world. Nothing like this has ever happened to anybody. Why do these things always happen to me? I'm sitting there going, your meal at McDonald's was 4.5 minutes late. Put it in perspective, please. They're so soft. They have no resilience. They haven't learned that there is a time and a place for everything. So having learned that, Solomon, having accepted and learned that there is a time and a place, and that, generally speaking, life's categories and major events are ordained by God, how does that help Solomon? Well, does the vanity ultimately disappear from a physical perspective? Has what Solomon has written in chapter 2, verse 17 to 23 stopped being true? No. Solomon, for all his wisdom, is going to end up in the grave, and he's been there for a while now, just like the fools of his time. They are both in the grave. Solomon has no more wealth, neither has the fool. But the difference is that one can see God's work in something, it is better able to accept that these are the circumstances of life and to be content with that. Generally speaking, though, Solomon acknowledges that for the righteous, life is going to be better than for the fool. That having said that for all his advantage of wisdom, he's still going to die, in verse 24, he realizes that this is a gift of God, that a man should eat and drink and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This is the gift of God. He says that at the end of verse 13, chapter 3. God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. Now, keep in mind that this is, again, a general truism that's written in the Old Testament, but for the most part, I think that this does have some application for today. That there are a lot of things as Christians that we end up having. We don't get involved with a lot of drugs, a lot of drinking, a lot of poor health decisions that we end up having when we follow Christ, a good work ethic, that we don't generally get in trouble with the law. All of these things, when implemented in life, generally lead to a higher quality of life than somebody who lives life loose and fast. That following the principles of Christ, following the gospel, we're going to live life in a way that I think, generally speaking, still puts us in the category that Solomon has. And I think as well an application for us is that just because Paul writes that our focus is to be on heaven and that we are to pursue the things of heaven, doesn't mean that we can't enjoy life at all. That Solomon here is saying that if we've worked hard, we should enjoy the fruit of our labor, the food and the drink that comes from that. That is a gift of God. That we have earned that and that we can enjoy the things that we have earned in life. Now, the difference is, of course, is that as Christians, we also want to make sure that we are helping those that are in need with what we've been blessed with. But we don't have to go out. We don't have to get a good job. We don't have to work for our money and then sit there and be stoic and stone-faced about it and never enjoy a penny that we've earned because we think that by doing so that we'll have somehow made our perspective solely earthly. In fact, we can rejoice in that. Solomon says it is God's gift that he has given to us. And when we accept that that's God's gift, we can enjoy life way more. And we can enjoy life more, I believe, as well when we suffer adversity, because we also know that if there is a time to lose, there'll likely be a time to gain again. We can have a little faith and we can have a little trust in that. Now, here's an interesting thing that he adds a dimension to. He has made everything beautiful in its time. So all of these things that are in this list, they are in their own way beautiful, even though we have sometimes difficulty recognizing that. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. Another reason why Solomon was miserable was because in some instances, there just isn't an answer. He says that right there. No one can find out the work of God from beginning to end. Solomon was the wisest man in the world, with the exception, of course, of Jesus. But Solomon, as a man, may have had about biological knowledge, perhaps more knowledge than Jesus as a man. But as far as wisdom being the fear of God and obeying his will, Jesus is, of course, the wisest, even wiser than Solomon. If anyone was going to be able to figure it out, it's Solomon. And he writes right there, there's just some things in life you'll never be able to figure out. And he says that in verse 13. Surely God has appointed chapter 7, verse 14. Surely God has appointed the other one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. There is a deliberate limit to man's knowledge that even the wisest man in history had put on him. Solomon couldn't figure it out. And the end result is that men should fear before him, chapter 3, verse 14. If Solomon can't figure it out, you and I certainly won't be able to either. There's just certain things in life that we have to accept, and we have to accept from God in general, not necessarily the specifics, the categories that were spoken of here. Now, I want to turn your attention to verse 15. Verse 14 and verse 15 And Solomon does this. This book follows cycles very similar to the one that he described in chapter 1, where he circles back to various perspectives and builds on them. He says, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken away from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That which has already been and that which has, I don't know why this one messes me up so much. And what is to be has already been, and God requires an account of what is past. That is essentially a shortened version of the conclusion that he draws in chapter 12. Go ahead and enjoy life, but keep in mind that God is going to bring into judgment everything that we've done. So enjoy it, but make sure that you're enjoying it according to God's will, not your own will. That is a shortened version of the conclusion right there. I find it interesting that he goes ahead and he the way that this is worded at the end of verse 15 is interesting. I've looked it up in various translations. And if we go ahead and we say, it translated almost literally, it is God seeks that which is pursued. It's an interesting phrase. God seeks that which is pursued. Translators have chosen to translate it like this: God requires an account of what is past. And I think that is a correct translation. But God seeks what is pursued, to me, adds a dimension to it that I don't know about you, that frightens me a little bit. God looks at what it is that we chased in life. So it's not just a matter of let's add up this, let's look at each deed individually. Let's look at the pattern. What was your highest priority in life? As Jesus says, where your treasures are, there your heart is also. If the majority of our life was spent pursuing wealth and we ignored our spiritual life, God is going to see that. He is going to seek that which we pursued. If what we chose to follow in life was pleasure above everything else, he's going to quickly see what our highest priority in life is. The pattern of our life and of our deeds is going to quickly reveal to us what we thought the most important thing was. And that's regardless of what we say the most important thing was. We could very well say, I believe that following Jesus is the most important thing in life, and then go out and live our life as if it's not. And maybe we've deceived ourselves in that regard, but we would fall into the same category as the Pharisees. These people draw near to me with their lips, but their heart's far from me. And we would quickly notice, and God notices and sees, that we've lived a life that goes contrary to his will. Friends, if God was to evaluate and judge our life right now, what would he see that we chased as the highest priority in our life? If it's not Jesus, we need to make sure that it is. If we think that we're following the Lord, but we're not living according to his will, that is not what we are pursuing with our whole heart. Solomon doesn't talk about Jesus. He can't, because the Spirit hadn't revealed that to him yet. But let me tell you that if Solomon was writing this today, I think he would add something to the effect that the ultimate chasing of the wind is living a life without God and living a life without Jesus as your Savior. There is a man out there who has incredible wealth beyond anything any of us could imagine. Well, there's multiple men and women, but Warren Buffett, Donald Trump, Bill Gates, they all come to mind. They all have ridiculously stupid amounts of money. I mean, if they wanted to turn this whole building into solid gold, as frivolous as that is, that they could. And yet, for all of their money, they are going to suffer the exact same fate that Solomon talks about here in chapter 2. He said the wise and the fool, they both suffer the same fate. All is vanity and grasping for the wind. Those that have lived a life without Christ Solomon doesn't specifically put it in here, but that would be the ultimate grasping for the wind. That would be the ultimate vanity. Where are we for time right now? Oh, 10:48. Okay. So I think rather than trying to rush through this next section, we'll stop here and take a break before our worship service. I'll just simply say, go ahead and read chapter 3, verse 16, and chapter 4 is not particularly long. Go ahead and read chapter 4 as well for next Sunday of Ecclesiastes. I'll say simply this, that you'll notice when you're reading it that there's a shift that Solomon makes now in the content and style from this portion, from about verse 16 until the conclusion that he comes up to roughly in chapter 12. In this regard, it parallels Proverbs. You remember in Proverbs that he spends about the first 9 chapters really laying the groundwork for a lot of principles, and then Solomon gets into the individual Proverbs for the remainder of the book. Ecclesiastes is arranged similar to that, where now he's going to, having established, I guess you could say, the argument or the thesis of the book, Solomon now goes to a lot of individual life scenarios where he says, moreover, I saw in the sun, or I considered in my heart, all of these different aspects of life. We'll take a short break, and then we'll resume at 11.